and we heard this a lot today all the way through, is how do we get to a bipartisan, nonpartisan understanding, compromise, arrangement? So I'm going to start with Bob and then Mayor and then Nick and just move right on down and say, all right, can we get to a nonpartisan, bipartisan compromise on taxes? Where have you seen it done? How did they do it? And what would you advise us to, is it the approachment or how do we frame this?
Yes, you can get there, and this meeting is one way to do it, but what the three groups did in May is even more significant. You set the roadmap by coming up with an agreed-on list of $300 million by getting rid of tax expenditures, a certain list of specific tax expenditures. You also call upon the setting up a bipartisan commission to look at state and local taxes, and you laid out some very specific criteria. Let me tell you, based on the pressures on the legislature, it's not going to come from the legislature, it's going to come from the grassroots. And if you can keep these three groups together, moving forward, you got the basics.
And I do want to interject before the mayor answers to explain this for the rest of the audience. This past spring, Greater Ohio Policy Center, Center for Community Solutions, and the Buckeye Institute got together and went to the General Assembly and requested what Bob has suggested here, is that we do basically a performance audit of the state's tax expenditures, aka tax abatements, tax credits, and if you are so inclined to call them tax giveaways. And the three groups standing up there in front of it got and as the words of John Honig from the Center for Community Solutions, the message was the fact we were simply doing this to a certain degree. If we can do it, you can do it. So I want to back up a little bit, explain a little bit behind that. Mayor, your turn, please. Well, how do we get to a nonpartisan, bipartisan?
Yeah, I think it's more difficult for me maybe to talk in the statewide level because I'm not sure all the players here. But if you look at what's going on in Washington, it's similar. And I think that I agree with Bob. I had written down here some comments about how you have to, in my opinion, empower a group of people, and you have to say we trust these individuals. And it's based on what Dr. Rivlin talked about, that these discussions need to be based on arithmetic and not politics. It's crazy to talk about a tax increase in today's world. I did it 4 years ago in my election year. Came out and told people the most honest thing that any politician can do was tell you that we need money down the road to hire police and fire. The economy just is sputtering. And we had been 28 whatever years without a tax increase. And they didn't want to listen. And some people took political advantage, and I almost lost my election. So I now go to conferences and say, don't ever put a tax increase on in an election year. But we have to get people to start dealing with the truth. And I think the way you do that, and a lot of this is based on trust. I just had a conversation with Dr. Rivlin about what went on with the group of 12. I think you empower them in a way that actually cities have done with economic development. In some cities, there isn't the political will to do downtown development or do some development, and they set up a development. It's not the way our government's supposed to work, but sometimes politicians can't make the tough decisions, and so they empower somebody else. I think by saying we're gonna make a commitment to abide by, and I don't know, pick a rabbi, a priest, and a minister as the three top heads and say we trust them, and then go from there to fill out another 9 people or something, and then say we're going to take their recommendation because they will reach, because we know they're trusted individuals. And I know it's not normal in state or federal, but it is the same process that they were talking about, Domenici and Rivlin and the previous efforts to trust somebody and then accept their recommendations.
Yeah, and what you're in effect saying, it's a moral leadership is to a certain degree what you're looking for here. Nick.
Somebody people will trust.
Yes. Right. Nick.
Yeah, so you ask how do you get to a bipartisan or nonpartisan approach, and I think the answer is, let me back up. I think the question is how do we get back to a bipartisan approach? And the answer, historically speaking, I mean, I'm not a political analyst, but historically speaking, A bipartisan approach is a balanced approach. I mean, you know, in the response to the great loss of revenue in the early 1990s, the vast majority of states took a balanced approach. They cut spending and they raised new taxes. First part of the previous decade, same thing. 2008, 2009, 2010, 33 states raised some kind of tax or fee revenue, and some of those packages were quite big, and in some states that was on a bipartisan basis. At the federal level, both Dr. Rivlin and Dr. Laffer were talking about the bipartisan Bowles-Simpson plan, $1 in new revenue for every $2 in spending cuts. The Gang of Six plan, 3 Republican senators, 3 Democratic senators, $1 new revenue for every $2 in spending cuts. But neither, you know, unfortunately, Alan Simpson, who was co-chair of Bowles-Simpson, is not currently an elected member of his party in Congress, and the Gang of Six plan was rejected by their party's own leadership. When it came to the 12-member supercommittee, that went out the window. So, you know, I think when you think about what it is that we're trying to accomplish in the course of balancing a budget, finding some kind of reasonable solution, part of trust is being willing to put everything on the table and address it very seriously. If you look at what voters support, we've done polling. I've seen polling in lots and lots of states, and the vast majority of voters say they want everything on the table. They want to think about not just an all-cuts approach, but one that includes new revenues. So, you know, it sounds almost simplistic to say, but that used to be how we addressed budget problems, and it isn't at this precise moment, and I think that's what's really hanging us up.
Well, then I want to go back to you, Nick, on this follow-up question. In your presentation, you had a fascinating bit of numbers that I did not know. And so that was in Ohio, it's 11% and 12% that's what everybody else pays, and then the top 1% pays 7.5% other income in taxes. And that got me started thinking, is that due to, and this kind of trails into one of the other primary questions that Bob also brought up, was tax expenditures. Does that play a role in this type of disequalization? And the irony here in Ohio, and there's a couple of people here who may know the number better than me, I've slept since I've last read it. Ohio gives away about $7.5 billion a year in tax expenditures. We receive in tax income, I think $7.7 billion. So it just about balances out. So talk a little bit, if you would, about tax expenditures. Do we need them? How does this, everybody
Sure.
does it? Is it just like junior high where everybody has to do what everybody else is doing? Or
Right,
is there a
right.
way to break out of this?
So
And
this-
how does this affect some of our tax structure, our tax decisions?
So this is the point in the conversation, right, where the two panelists at lunchtime said, yeah, we got to look at tax expenditures, and I think we all agree, got to look at tax expenditures. Maybe now is the time when we actually start talking about what it really means when you start digging into the details of tax expenditures and how actually that's pretty challenging, and we shouldn't underestimate the challenge. Should we do it? Yeah, we put out a report a year or two ago that looked at every state just for how well they reported their information on tax expenditures. Do they do a decent job of documenting how much they spend on tax expenditures, and what do they think they're accomplishing with that spending? And just so, in case folks aren't familiar with the term, a tax expenditure is essentially any provision in the tax code that causes the state or the locality or the federal government, in the case of the federal government, to lose money, and in other words, for people to gain money. And from a fiscal perspective, a tax expenditure is very similar to direct spending, but there's less accountability attached to it. Okay, so how do we actually dive into it? The challenge is that the term tax expenditures includes everything from the home mortgage interest deduction, which if anyone here is with the real estate industry or knows anyone in the real estate industry or owns a home, you know how sacrosanct that tax expenditure is. That's a huge one. Personal exemptions. So a lot of the tax breaks for expenditures on health care, so a lot of wide-ranging kinds of spending are into that category of tax expenditures. So when you start going after tax expenditures, you discover that in reality, it's a lot harder. Some tax expenditures do benefit high-income families.